In the spring of 1933, the Ob River flowed wide and slow through the Siberian plain. Its waters carried ice from distant mountains, and the surrounding forests were dense with pine and birch. The riverbanks were marshy in places, dotted with patches of reeds and low shrubs. The land was flat, open in some stretches, but in others, the river wound through narrow channels, forming small islands that rose just above the water. One of these islands, roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide, lay isolated, with no permanent settlements nearby. Its soil was thin and sandy, offering little shelter from wind or flood. The island was largely uninhabited, save for the occasional migratory birds or tracks of wildlife. In late May, the spring thaw had begun, and the river's current was swift. Driftwood floated past, and the air carried the faint smell of damp earth. The wind moved steadily across the island, cold against exposed skin, and the terrain offered few natural barriers against the elements. Trees were sparse, and the reeds along the shore did little to block the gusts that swept across the sand. From the river, the island appeared small and manageable, but for anyone arriving without preparation, it was remote. The nearest settlements were tens of miles away, accessible only by river transport. The isolation was absolute. No bridges, no paths, no nearby villages. For those who would soon be deposited here, the environment itself was indifferent. The river, the wind, the sand, and the scattered vegetation framed the island as a quiet, still space, yet beneath that calm, the absence of food, shelter, and human presence would soon be felt. The island waited silently, empty except for the people who would be forced onto it. The Ob River carried them, but no one knew when or if relief would come. For now, the scene was one of quiet exile, a small, remote landmass cut off from society, defined by its geography and its isolation, with the soft sounds of water and wind the only markers of life. The group sent to Nazino Island in 1933 consisted primarily of Soviet citizens labeled as undesirable under the policies of forced resettlement. Many were arrested for minor infractions, petty crimes, or political reasons. Others were peasants deemed socially harmful, or individuals with no clear means of supporting themselves within the emerging Soviet system. In total, several thousand men and women were selected for relocation. Most were young or middle-aged, and many had little experience surviving in remote wilderness. Some had worked on farms, factories, or in urban trades, but very few had knowledge of hunting, fishing, or building shelter in harsh environments. The plan to send these prisoners to the island was part of a broader Soviet initiative to colonize and settle remote regions along Siberian rivers. Authorities sought to move populations away from populated areas and use the labor of deportees to cultivate land or establish settlements. The process was bureaucratic and rushed. Supplies were minimal, and transportation was conducted by barges along the Ob River. People were told they would be working in new settlements, though the conditions they would face were rarely explained. When the prisoners arrived at the river embarkation points, they were grouped in large numbers. Men, women, and children were often packed together on barges with little attention to basic needs. Food provisions were insufficient for the journey or for the work they were expected to undertake. Clothing was inadequate for the Siberian climate in late spring, and few had tools or utensils for building or cooking. The river trip itself lasted several days, with stops along the way to load additional groups of prisoners. The conditions were cramped, unsanitary, and disorienting, reinforcing a sense of helplessness before the island itself became visible. Upon approaching Nazino Island, the scale of the isolation became apparent. The island was small, flat, and uninhabited. It had no structures, no cultivated land, and only thin patches of grass and reeds. The surrounding river, wide and fast, marked the boundary beyond which no easy escape was possible. For the deportees, this was a place entirely separate from the settlements they had known. There were no roads, no paths, no nearby villages. The land was essentially a blank slate, but without resources or preparation, it was inhospitable. The population of the island swelled to several thousand within hours, creating a dense, chaotic settlement of people who had never met and had no shared leadership. Authorities provided little guidance, and the deportees were expected to organize themselves. Supplies were inadequate, a few sacks of flour, some salted fish, and a handful of tools were distributed among hundreds. There were no shelters, no tents, no stoves. The deportees faced exposure to the elements immediately, and the thin sand of the island offered no protection from wind, rain, or sudden storms. Even before any action had been taken by the prisoners, the conditions imposed by policy were severe. Hunger was imminent, and the lack of structure meant that disputes were likely. The physical and mental preparation of the group was almost non-existent. Most had traveled long distances under stressful conditions and now confronted an environment that offered only the basic necessities of survival at a distance too great to hope for rapid assistance. The deportees arrived without a clear understanding of what survival would require. Geography and policy combined to create a setting in which isolation, scarcity, and vulnerability were immediate facts. The island, quiet and indifferent, would witness human behavior in its most extreme form. In the absence of infrastructure, leadership, and adequate supplies, the prisoners were left to confront the challenges of hunger, exposure, and human conflict on their own. As the prisoners stepped onto the sand of Nazino Island, the reality of their situation became undeniable. The barges departed shortly after unloading, leaving the deportees without immediate contact with any nearby settlements. The Ob River stretched wide on all sides, its waters swift and cold. There was no bridge, no ferry, no possibility of returning to the mainland without substantial effort or assistance. For most, the moment they set foot on the island marked a clear point of no return. The first challenge was shelter. The island offered no natural structures, only sparse reeds, driftwood, and low patches of grass. Some groups attempted to construct rudimentary lean-tos or dug shallow trenches in the sand to shield themselves from the wind. Others simply remained exposed. The spring weather brought fluctuating temperatures, with cold nights and occasional rain. The thin layer of soil and lack of vegetation left little protection from flooding or the elements. Food was immediately scarce. The small allotments of flour and salted fish distributed by authorities were insufficient for the population. Some tried to gather edible roots or hunt for small animals, but knowledge of the environment was minimal. Fishing in the river was dangerous due to strong currents and a lack of equipment. Within hours, the threat of hunger became apparent, and the psychological weight of scarcity began to settle over the group. Tension grew as the deportees realized there was no formal leadership or guidance. Crowds formed spontaneously, and informal hierarchies emerged. Disputes over food, space, and priority for shelter were common. There was no enforcement, no authority present beyond the initial landing, and the island's isolation meant that any external intervention would take days or weeks. Even at this early stage, small acts of desperation appeared. Individuals attempted to swim across channels to nearby patches of land or retrieve driftwood, often failing or returning exhausted. The distance to safety, measured in miles along the river or across treacherous water, reinforced the prisoners' confinement. The isolation was not abstract, it was immediate and physical. By the end of the first day, the prisoners confronted a reality that could not be reversed. The Ob River had taken away the barges. The land offered no abundant resources. The population was large and unprepared. For every individual, the island represented both home and prison, a landscape where human endurance would soon be tested. The tension between environment, scarcity, and human behavior had begun to define the experience of Nazino, setting the stage for the challenges that would follow. Once the initial shock of isolation had passed, the prisoners on Nazino Island began to establish routines, though these were improvised and fragile. The first priority for most was shelter. Small groups scavenged driftwood, reeds, and scraps of fabric to create lean-tos or low huts. Some dug shallow pits in the sand to block the wind. These shelters were crude and offered limited protection, but they provided a semblance of structure in an otherwise open and exposed environment. Nights remained cold, and rain could turn the sand into mud, testing the endurance of even the strongest. Food, however, proved more elusive. The small rations delivered by authorities were quickly depleted. Flour was shared sparingly, and the salted fish, already minimal, ran out within days. Those with some experience in agriculture or fishing attempted to catch fish from the river or gather edible plants, but knowledge was sparse, and tools were scarce. Improvised fishing lines were fashioned from threads of clothing, hooks from scraps of metal, and spears from sharpened sticks. Foraging for roots and wild greens yielded small quantities, often barely enough to sustain life. Groups of prisoners began forming around those with even minimal experience in survival techniques. Informal leaders emerged, usually individuals who had worked as laborers or in forestry and possessed some knowledge of the environment. These leaders organized small teams to fish, gather wood, or defend limited food supplies. Despite these efforts, scarcity and exhaustion undermined cooperation. Disputes over resources became common, and the social cohesion of the group was fragile. Hygiene was almost non-existent. The river was used both as a water source and, inadvertently, as a place for waste disposal. Illnesses spread quickly, including dysentery and respiratory infections exacerbated by exposure to wind and rain. The combination of malnutrition and disease weakened the prisoners further, making survival increasingly difficult. Despite these conditions, many continued to perform basic tasks, collecting wood, preparing food, and maintaining their improvised shelters. Mental strategies became essential. Prisoners sought to maintain routine and structure to preserve a sense of control. Some groups designated watches or rotations for gathering firewood and fishing. Others kept track of days by observing tides or the position of the sun. These small methods provided a psychological anchor, a way to mark time and assert some control over an otherwise uncontrollable environment. Adaptation to the extreme scarcity also produced early signs of desperation. Reports from later investigations note instances of theft, hoarding, and violence. Arguments over small quantities of food frequently escalated. The lack of sufficient nutrition impaired judgment and reduced the capacity for cooperation. Yet, even in these conditions, a majority of prisoners continued to attempt conventional survival strategies, building shelters, foraging, and fishing. Despite the collapse of formal authority, some emergent systems of order appeared. Small groups self-organized to protect one another and share knowledge. Leaders attempted to distribute the remaining flour and fish equitably, though limited success meant that inequality and tension were unavoidable. The island became a patchwork of micro-societies, each functioning according to its own rules, improvising as necessity demanded. Time on the island began to stretch. Days and nights blurred together. The repetition of gathering, preparing, and consuming food became the central rhythm of life. Physical labor, hunger, and exposure dominated the prisoners' experience. Few were able to rest fully, and sleep often occurred in short intervals. Energy was conserved where possible, and mental focus shifted toward immediate survival tasks. Small innovations emerged out of necessity. Makeshift tools, crude cooking methods, and rudimentary barriers against wind and rain reflected both ingenuity and the limits of what could be achieved with minimal resources. Individuals with prior experience in carpentry, hunting, or fishing found their skills in demand. These skills, however, could not overcome the fundamental shortages of food, shelter, and medical care. By the end of several weeks, the island was a place defined by adaptation and endurance. The prisoners had created temporary structures, improvised methods of gathering food, and attempted to impose order. Yet the environment remained indifferent. Exposure, hunger, and disease persisted, and the risk of escalation into more extreme behavior loomed constantly. Survival was fragile, dependent on small, daily accomplishments rather than any long-term security. As days turned into weeks, the situation on Nazino Island deteriorated. Hunger deepened, and the initial routines of shelter building, foraging, and fishing became insufficient to sustain the population. Bodies weakened from insufficient nutrition, and illnesses spread rapidly. Dysentery, scurvy, and respiratory infections claimed strength quickly, reducing the prisoners' ability to work or maintain their fragile shelters. The physical decline was visible, gaunt faces, trembling limbs, and lethargy marked those who remained. Social cohesion eroded under the constant strain of scarcity. The informal hierarchies established in earlier weeks were fragile and increasingly challenged. Arguments over food became violent, groups that had attempted to cooperate began to fracture. Theft and hoarding became common, driven by desperation. The river and the sand, once indifferent observers, now bore witness to acts of aggression as survival instincts overcame social norms. Exposure to the elements compounded the prisoners' suffering. Cold nights and wet days left many shivering and exhausted. Clothing was inadequate for protection, and improvised shelters could not block the wind or rain entirely. Fatigue and constant vigilance against the environment exacerbated physical weakness, creating a cycle where survival efforts themselves drained the prisoners' energy. As starvation intensified, behaviors shifted further. Accounts from later investigations indicate that some prisoners resorted to cannibalism. The extreme scarcity forced choices unthinkable under normal circumstances. Social order collapsed, and the island became a place where human behavior was reduced to immediate survival. Conflict, desperation, and the pressure of hunger blurred ethical and social boundaries. Time began to lose meaning. Days and nights were difficult to distinguish. Prisoners measured survival in hours rather than days. Sleep was fragmented, food acquisition became the central focus, and the routine of existence narrowed to the most basic tasks. The physical and psychological toll of the conditions created a continuous strain, eroding hope and reducing the ability to plan beyond immediate needs. The breakdown extended beyond individuals to entire groups. Makeshift communities dissolved under pressure. Those who had attempted to organize shared resources or coordinate shelter construction found their efforts undermined by scarcity and violence. The island, already inhospitable, now amplified the consequences of human conflict. The river, the wind, and the sand remained indifferent, yet the human response to deprivation reshaped the landscape of life on Nazino. Deaths became common. The combination of hunger, exposure, and disease claimed more prisoners daily. Bodies were often left where they fell or hastily buried in shallow sand pits, and the scale of mortality grew rapidly. Survivors faced the grim reality of their environment, understanding that the conditions themselves could be fatal. By the end of this period, Nazino Island was defined by the breakdown of order. The initial routines and adaptations that had allowed survival for a short time were no longer sufficient. Scarcity, isolation, and human desperation created a setting in which survival was a continuous struggle, and the limits of endurance were exposed in stark detail. After several weeks, Soviet authorities returned to Nazino Island to assess the settlement effort. The barges that had deposited the prisoners earlier now retrieved the remaining survivors, documenting the scale of suffering and loss. Of the thousands sent to the island, only a fraction remained alive. Many had perished from starvation, disease, or exposure, and the site bore evidence of both neglect and human desperation. Investigators recorded the conditions with clinical attention. Makeshift shelters were scattered across the sand, some partially collapsed. Remnants of minimal food supplies were found alongside signs of violence among the prisoners. The river had claimed driftwood and personal belongings, erasing traces of earlier survival attempts. Those who remained were weak, malnourished, and ill, but still able to board the barges. The surviving prisoners were relocated to other settlements along the Ob River, though the environment remained harsh. Medical care, minimal though it was provided to some, and authorities documented the fatalities and conditions as part of an official report. The numbers indicated that human life had been tested to its limit. Rescue was not an act of triumph but an administrative procedure. It closed the chapter on immediate survival without mitigating the losses that had already occurred. The aftermath of Nazino Island emphasized the consequences of policy and geography. The deportees had faced extreme isolation, inadequate resources, and environmental hazards beyond their preparation. Their survival, in any measure, was fragile and contingent. The episode remained a historical record of endurance under imposed conditions, illustrating both the limits of human adaptation and the costs of neglect. The events on Nazino Island stand as a stark illustration of human vulnerability under extreme isolation and deprivation. Geography, policy, and circumstance combined to place ordinary individuals in conditions where the struggle for survival overshadowed every other aspect of life. Hunger reshaped behavior, social norms collapsed, and endurance was measured in the simplest acts: finding shelter, acquiring food, and maintaining a fragile daily routine. Historically, the incident is a record of the consequences of state decisions imposed on unprepared populations. It demonstrates how human behavior adapts under relentless scarcity, and how the environment, silent, indifferent, and unyielding, can amplify the effects of policy and neglect. The suffering of the deportees is preserved in reports and testimony, providing evidence of endurance and human limits rather than dramatized heroism. The quiet significance of Nazino lies in its observation of humanity in extremis. The island itself, the river, and the sands remained unchanged, indifferent witnesses to the unfolding events. The story concludes not with celebration or triumph, but with the documentation of survival, loss, and the restrained testimony of what occurred when isolation and hunger intersected.